In the previous programme, we considered moral realism, and we noted that there's some disagreement amongst realists about whether moral properties are natural or non-natural. In this programme, we're going to consider anti-realist views, those which oppose realism. We'll begin with moral error theory. Moral error theorists agree with realists that moral judgments are attempts to describe the moral properties of the world. In other words, like realists, error theorists are cognitivists about moral judgment. However, unlike realists, moral error theorists think that our moral judgments are systematically false. Given that to know something requires that it's true, there is no moral knowledge. The explanation for this widespread falsity, according to error theorists, is that mind-independent moral properties like wrongness do not exist. So, moral error theorists would agree that in response to the George Floyd case, some of you formed the belief that his killing was wrong. But the belief that the killing of George Floyd was wrong is not an instance of knowledge. It's not even true. It's an inaccurate description of the world. The reason why it's inaccurate is not, however, because the killing of George Floyd was right. According to error theorists, no actions have the property of being wrongful, and no actions have the property of being right. Nothing is really right or wrong. So, although we make moral judgments all the time, we are in error when we do so, hence the name error theory. To bring out the radical nature of the view, note some of its straightforward implications. The killing of George Floyd was not wrong. Torturing children for fun is not wrong. No one was really to blame for the Holocaust. Martin Luther King was not a good person. Moral error theory will strike many of you as extreme, so there better be some good reasons for accepting it. Here we'll consider the so-called argument from queerness for error theory, first expounded by J.L. Mackie in his book Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. To understand Mackie's argument, it might help to begin with another more familiar kind of error theory, atheism. You can understand atheism as an error theory about God's existence. Here's how some atheists argue. First, they make a conceptual claim that our concept of God is the concept of an all-loving, all-knowing and all-powerful being. So a belief in God is a belief that such a being exists. However, atheists then make an ontological claim, that is a claim about what exists. They say, look, there's nothing in the world that has those features. For instance, they might argue that a being with such features is incompatible with the existence of evil, or that there's something inherently contradictory about these features. So we have an argument for an error theory, in this case atheism, that's composed of a conceptual claim and an ontological one. Now turn to Mackie. His argument from queerness works in a broadly similar way. Recall that Mackie endorsed cognitivism, that moral judgments are an attempt to describe moral properties. But error theorists like Mackie also think that when we make moral judgments, we are presupposing that features like wrongness are what he called objectively prescriptive. This is roughly the hopefully now familiar idea that properties like wrongness entail the existence of mind-independent categorical reasons for action. So in this view, when I judge that Floyd's killing was wrong, I'm judging that I and everybody else had reasons to refrain from acting in that sort of way, no matter what our attitudes are. This is moral error theory's conceptual claim. Now that might make Mackie sound like a realist, perhaps even a non-naturalist realist, but he's not. He goes on to make an ontological claim, that there are no mind-independent categorical reasons. If they existed, mind-independent categorical reasons would be very queer properties of the world. They'd be very odd, strange, unlike anything else that we're familiar with. Without some very good reason to think otherwise, we should reject their existence. One way of thinking about the alleged oddity or queerness here is like this. Error theorists are worried that realism has the implication that the human independent universe somehow cares about or has a view about how we ought to be acting. But that's a very weird notion. We've surely got no reason to think that it's actually true. Another related line of thought that Mackie pursued is that if there were such odd features, these categorical reasons, we'd need some very strange, unique way of knowing about them. Right? We'd need some special faculty of moral perception or intuition to detect them. But we've got absolutely no evidence that such a faculty exists. So yet another reason to reject realism. Note that in order to be plausible, error theorists like Mackie owe us an account of why we make moral judgments, why certain actions seem to be really wrong. Think again about the George Floyd case. What Chauvin did really seemed wrong. If the error theorist simply says, well, people just make judgments and they're all in error, sorry, there's something missing in their view. In the absence of an account, a realist might rightfully claim that they've got the upper hand. Right? Their view can nicely explain why we make moral judgments, why certain actions really do seem wrong. It's because there are moral properties and sometimes we detect them. But Mackey and other error theorists do have an alternative account. Roughly, they think that there are evolutionary pressures, evolutionary benefits to moral thinking and language. Societies that moralise will be more likely to cooperate with each other and to do better than those that don't. That's why the practice of moral judgment has persisted, in spite of the absence of any moral properties. Let's consider a way in which realists might respond to the error theorist's queerness argument. One approach, sometimes known as a companion in guilt strategy, is to reject the ontological claim by pointing to other examples of mind-independent categorical reasons about which an error theory seems really implausible. Here's an example. Isn't it very plausible that if you appreciate the truth of the premises of an argument, and you also appreciate that the argument is valid, that you ought to believe the conclusion, or else give up the premises? And isn't it the case that you have that reason no matter what your attitudes are? For instance, whether or not you want to believe the conclusion. If so, then this looks like it's a non-moral example of a mind-independent categorical reason that most would hesitate to deny the existence of. Indeed, a denial of the existence of such a reason might be self-defeating for the error theorist. After all, error theorists provide arguments for their view. But now it looks like they may be committed to claiming that sound arguments don't provide reasons to believe their conclusions. Indeed, some have worried that moral error theory actually entails a kind of general nihilism, according to which there are no reasons to believe or do anything. Instead of endorsing error theory, some who are suspicious of moral realism have pursued a different kind of approach. Recall that moral realists and moral error theorists have a shared commitment to cognitivism, the view that moral judgments are descriptive. Against this, non-cognitivists claim that moral thought and language are non-descriptive. To help understand this idea, let's consider an early version of the view, emotivism, defended among others by A.J. Ayer in his book Language, Truth and Logic. According to emotivism, moral language, such as the statement that Floyd's killing was wrong, isn't an attempt to accurately describe moral properties. Instead, moral language plays a non-descriptive role, namely to give expression to our emotional states. So for Ayer, the statement that Floyd's killing is wrong expresses the speaker's negative emotional reaction to the Floyd killing and performs a kind of a practical role in trying to persuade others. Note that Ayer's view is not that moral judgments describe our emotional reactions. That is, the Floyd statement isn't to be understood as meaning, I feel really negatively about this action. Instead, the statement, Floyd's killing is wrong, means something more like, boo to Floyd's killing. Indeed, A.J. Ayer's philosophy was sometimes referred to as the philosophy of boo and hooray. There are other versions of non-cognitivism. For example, R.M. Hare's view that moral judgments are commands or prescriptions. What unites all of these versions is their view that moral language is non-descriptive. Note also that despite its early proponents being focused on language, non-cognitivism is normally extended to apply to moral thought too. According to such views, when I think that the killing of Floyd was wrong, I am in a state of mind that's non-descriptive, such as a state of dislike or disapproval or desire against the action. Let's trace some implications of non-cognitivism. If moral judgments are non-descriptive, then they can't be true or false. And if they can't be true or false, then they can't be instances of knowledge, since knowledge requires truth. On this view, moral judgments just aren't in the business of accurately describing moral properties. Instead, they perform a distinctive practical function. Right? Their role is to try to get us to do things or get other people to do things, to refrain from doing things. If we understand moral judgment along these lines, then there's little or no point in positing mind-independent moral properties. So non-cognitivists, like error theorists, deny the existence of these. But note that, unlike error theorists, the absence of such a realm doesn't leave us in error. Since moral judgments aren't descriptive, they can't be mistaken. So one reason why Ayer was attracted to emotivism was his belief that cognitivism about moral judgments has unacceptable implications. Here's Ayer's line of thought. If we assume that moral judgments are descriptive, then they must either be about natural or non-natural properties. Ayer accepted Moore's open question argument, that if moral properties existed, then they could not be natural properties. But he wasn't a non-naturalist. This is partly because of Ayer's commitment to a theory of meaning called verificationism. Roughly, on this view, a statement could be meaningful if and only if it's empirically verifiable. So for instance, the statement that it's sunny outside has meaning because it's empirically verifiable, right? Because we can look out the window and check. But if we're non-naturalists about moral properties, then moral properties are only knowable by something like intuition. And Ayer notes there's much discrepancy between people's moral intuitions. Hence, it seems that moral statements aren't empirically verifiable if we're non-naturalists. And hence, given verificationism, such statements would be meaningless. So cognitivism either leads to an implausible naturalism or to non-naturalism, in which case moral statements are literally without meaning. But Ayer thought that moral statements clearly aren't meaningless. So to avoid this terrible result, Ayer thought that the problem must lie in the initial assumption that moral judgments are descriptive. Instead, we should be non-cognitivists about moral judgment. Now perhaps the line of thought that has led most proponents to endorse non-cognitivism appeals to the link between moral judgment and motivation. Some version of this line of thought can be found in David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. It starts with the observation that moral judgments seem to have a special connection to motivation. Consider, for example, your judgment that Floyd's killing was wrong. For many people, that'll have been a catalyst for getting them to do various things, such as joining anti-racism groups, signing petitions, going on marches, reading certain types of books. More generally, someone who judges that something is wrong will be motivated, at least to some extent, to act and refrain from acting in various sorts of ways. Otherwise, you might worry that they're actually being sincere. Think of how odd it would be for someone to say, I really think that eating meat is wrong, but then to apparently feel absolutely no conflict or motivation to refrain from ordering a massive burger. So what's this got to do with non-cognitivism? Well, this connection between moral judgment and motivation is pretty puzzling if we assume that moral judgments are descriptive, as cognitivists do. Why is that? Well, because descriptive phenomena like beliefs don't seem to motivate us to do anything, at least not by themselves. For instance, believing that it's sunny in Glasgow won't get you to do anything by itself. You need something else, like a desire to enjoy sunny weather. Hence, it's not clear why there should be such an intimate connection between moral judgment and motivation if cognitivism is true. However, if we assume that moral judgments are non-descriptive, as non-cognitivists do, and hence that are something like expressions of emotion or states of disapproval, then given the intuitive connection between emotions, disapprovals and motivation, it becomes much easier to see why moral judgments are intimately connected to motivation. Hence, the link between moral motivation and moral judgment seems to point us towards non-cognitivism. Now, there are of course objections to non-cognitivism. One worry someone might have is that although non-cognitivists don't attribute a widespread error about morality to ordinary people, they are nevertheless committed to a kind of moral nihilism, that nothing is really wrong. All we have are attitudes. After all, they don't think that there are any mind-independent moral properties. This might make it seem problematic. A common worry pressed against non-cognitivism is that it seems to end up giving an implausible account of moral reasoning. Recall again the example of moral reasoning from before. Premise 1, all acts of intentional killing are wrongful. Premise 2, if all acts of intentional killing are wrongful, then Derek Chauvin's action was wrongful. Therefore, Derek Chauvin's action was wrongful. This looks like valid reasoning. If the premises were true, then the conclusion must be. However, as we noted earlier, it seems that in order for it to be valid, it must be the case that the premises are the sorts of things that could be true or false. But according to non-cognitivism, premise 1, all acts of intentional killing are wrongful, is neither true nor false, but is instead just an expression of emotion or disapproval. Actually, things are even worse for non-cognitivism. Premise 2 is also a moral claim. Right, remember, it's if all acts of intentional killing are wrongful, then Derek Chauvin's action was wrongful. But it's far from obvious what the non-cognitivist interpretation of this statement is supposed to be. It's not plausibly a denouncement of the intentional killing, nor is it a denouncement of Derek Chauvin's action. It's just a statement about the relationship between these two things. So it's not clear what it could be an approval or disapproval of. Without a clear account of what this statement actually means, it's even harder to understand how this kind of valid reasoning is supposed to work if non-cognitivism is true. It's worth noting that in recent years, more sophisticated versions of non-cognitivism have been developed in order to address these and other worries. Indeed, it's worth noting that responses to all of the arguments that I've presented can be found in the ever-growing philosophical literature. But for now, I've hopefully said enough to provide a starting point for you to think philosophically about realism and anti-realism about morality, about whether anything really is wrong.